Hello, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us for this Climate Week panel on disinformation, misinformation, and climate science. I think the best place to start is with the recent report from Secretary Wright at the Department of Energy on climate change. In this report, the secretary, who is or was a fracking pioneer and a gas executive in his prior life, acknowledges that climate change is real. And he says that his motivation for commissioning this report, and we can talk later about who wrote the report, but his motivation for commissioning the report was to have a discussion based on the science of climate change, which he calls a challenge, but not the existential threat to humanity that he feels the left portrays. That distinction, the real global threat to humanity, he says, is energy poverty, which I think hints at sort of where their policy is going, very heavily dominated by energy production, coal, oil, gas, as keys to America's energy dominance. The report's bottom line, and let me quote this for you, CO2-induced warming might be less damaging economically than commonly believed, and excessively aggressive mitigation policies could prove more detrimental than beneficial. That's the conclusion of the latest Energy Department report. So joining me today to break this down are Marianne Lavelle, our brilliant Washington bureau chief, and Bob Berwyn, who is our chief science writer. Welcome, Marianne.
Glad to be here again.
And Bob, great to have you.
Thanks for having me here.
Sure. So, the Wright report. Marianne, what did the vast majority of mainstream climate scientists think of this document?
Well, they think that it is, as you said, it's very misleading. And it's interesting because it's not out and out climate change isn't happening, but it's kind of dressed up as this scientific document, but it absolutely ignores what the mainstream consensus science is, and does so in a very clever way. Can I give you just one example?
Yes.
It says that elevated concentrations of CO2 directly enhance plant growth, globally contributing to quote unquote greening the planet and increasing agricultural productivity. Well, it would be really nice if that was what was happening. Greening sounds so good, and it does sound scientific. They're talking about CO2 concentrations, and they're admitting that they're going up. However, science has been very closely tracking what has been happening to CO2 in the atmosphere and how it's affecting plant life. And the signal is very clear that the Earth is not getting greener. It is in part due to intense wildfires and continued cutting down of forests. As a matter of fact, the rate of increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing. And that's most likely because these ecosystems like forests that we depend on to suck up the CO2, they're losing their ability to do so. The Arctic, for instance, used to be a carbon sink, and now it's a carbon source. Bob and I both have written about these things. Agricultural productivity, it is increasing in one important place, the Corn Belt. But that's not due to warming temperatures. That's due to things like genetically engineered crops and other steps that the farm operations are taking to increase yield. Globally, there's a very clear slowdown in the growth of agricultural output. At the same time, population is increasing. So one study found that due to climate change, productivity is 20% lower today than it would have been without climate change. So this is the way that this report makes it sound like it's paying attention to the science, but really is ignoring what most of the science is saying.
Yeah, I think Andrew Dessler from Texas A&M, he's the climate scientist who organized the group of 85 scientists who formally rebutted the Wright study. He called it a mockery of climate science when you add it all up. But there's no doubt that it very skillfully sort of muddies the water in acknowledging science, but then saying, well, it's not really clear. A number of people, including Dessler, have compared this tactic to sort of what big tobacco did with smoking research, trying to make it very uncertain or unclear what the research actually said.
Right. For instance, I mean, the bottom line of this report is climate change isn't making things more dangerous. That's what it's saying. And like much in misinformation, it's a very simple message. It's a very appealing message. But one example they give is they say, look at deaths from weather disasters. They've fallen over the past century. Look at how many people died in the Galveston hurricane of 1900, 8,000 people. Nothing near that has happened in recent years. Well, that's really because we have embraced science. We've embraced science for weather forecast. We have satellite weather forecasting. We have evacuation plans. We have alerts, emergency alerts and communications. None of these are perfect, of course, but they didn't exist in 1900. And what is happening now is that the Trump administration really is suggesting massive cuts to the agencies that do the climate and weather science and that help us adapt to the changes we're seeing at a time when change is happening more rapidly than it has in humanity's history.
Right. Bob, does the big tobacco analogy ring true to you?
Very, very much so. And there's research on that. There's a couple of great sort of recent histories of science and climate science that trace that by looking at documents. And the tobacco industry tried the same thing. They said, "Oh yeah, let's do more research. We need more studies," and they created think tanks and in fact, there's sort of almost a direct lineage from a couple of scientists now, both dead, two men, Fred Singer and Fred Seitz, who sort of segued from tobacco denialism into climate denialism and took on the same tactics and tried to get a few reports. Since you mentioned this one report from the Department of Energy, there's still some reports from the 80s from global warming denying think tanks that are still floating around out there on the internet as supposedly scientific rebuttals of mainstream climate science. I wanted to add too that this has reached a global level at this point. At the last COP29 in Baku, the UNFCCC, the Climate Change Convention, held a special session on global disinformation and specifically highlighted it as a threat to global climate action and launched an initiative against it and asked countries to sign on. And they didn't point the fingers at specific countries. That's not the way the UN does things. But this was right after the election, and there was already misleading information about climate coming from the U.S. government associated with the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and the rejection of the global climate framework.
Yeah. The Energy Department report repeatedly questions, it cites the climate models and repeatedly questions their accuracy and talks about the uncertainty of the models. But I think, in fact, the models, if anything, have been conservative over the past 20 years, have they not, in terms of predicting warming and related events from warming?
Yeah, Bob, go ahead.
I think they've been maybe conservative, but they've also been remarkably consistent and accurate from the very early days of climate science with very simple computers in the 1950s. And that's because carbon dioxide is such a dominant driver. And it wasn't that hard for people in the 50s, actually, even before that, to figure out, hey, if we add this much CO2, this is roughly what it's going to cause in terms of warming. What we know more of now are the impacts from that, a lot more. But that basic part of the equation, which makes it weird trying to hide it, because it's just been so well known for so long. There's so many different agencies all over the world, so many different science institutions tracking this and issuing reports and daily data. So I'm not sure how you could, muddy the waters, perhaps except in the minds of, a few people who aren't really sure what to think about global warming.
As a
Yeah.
matter of fact, Exxon itself did its own modeling in the late 70s, and you can see that they were pretty much on track
Yeah.
as to the amount of warming we would see with the amount of CO2 increase that we have seen. You can read about that on our website archive, The Road Not Taken. Exxon could have chose to rebrand itself as an energy company, but instead continued on the fossil fuel path, despite what its own scientists said.
Yeah. As I read the report and Secretary Wright's introduction to the report, I see this sort of kind of Trumpian tactic. Some people have described it as, every accusation being a projection. Wright says, for example, that the critics don't really want to engage in a discussion of climate science. And he even faults his critics for treating climate as a religious issue, which is, it strikes me as kind of a projection in some ways. But we're really a long way from climate change as a hoax, are we not?
Yes, yes. I think because people are seeing it in their own lives, because the
No, but
science,
I mean, we're a long way from
right.
their rhetorical jumping off point as essentially dismissing climate change as a hoax.
Well,
They're
what
not
I'm
doing that
saying
anymore.
is they've modified their rhetoric to say, yes, it's happening, but it's not going to be a big deal. It's not going to really harm us. The science has the science has taken into account a lot of the things that they're talking about and is coming up with far different conclusions, that it is very dangerous to
Yeah,
ecosystems and humanity.
yeah. One of the things Wright says is that he feels the media is getting climate science wrong. And I know, Bob, the media's treatment of climate science is something that you've thought a lot about. I think you're coming at it, though, from a very different perspective than the energy secretary, are you not?
Probably. I'm not sure. I didn't see that specific comment of his,
Yeah,
so I don't know the context exactly. And, he may be referring to, I mean, I shouldn't even speculate, but things like increasing hurricane intensity or attribution science that has been attacked for very specific reasons. I think that there's in my view, a more important story with the media and disinformation in especially the history of media, mainstream media coverage of climate as a sort of a two-sided story for decades beyond the point where it was pretty clear what the real story actually was. And I never understood the continued effort to try and present it like there was a debate on it. And as I've learned more about it, I realized it was only because there was this really industrious effort to keep it alive as a two-sided story. It was being fueled constantly by disinformation, and that's been hypercharged in the social media in our modern era. And in general, I think all media has gotten better at covering climate. There's no doubt about that. But also our media landscape and ecosystem is so fragmented that you could look at one part of it and say, wow, the New York Times has a great, climate section. And then there's Inside Climate News, which covers it inside out every day. And then you could go to another part of the internet and have your mind completely blown by the conspiracy theories that are not only being shared, but enthusiastically shared and amplified by people who I think have been, raised on a diet of disinformation. And so they're susceptible to these messages now.
Give me an example of one such conspiracy theory about climate change.
Um, Space lasers starting forest fires just comes to mind, or even steering weather systems. There was a hearing in Congress just a day or so ago. I was working on a story, so I didn't have a chance to watch it, but I hope there's a recording because I do want to try and catch bits and pieces of that too.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things I'm starting to hear from senior people in the Trump administration, is that we don't really need to worry about climate change so much anymore, because over the next decade, AI will figure it out. We'll figure out solutions like fusion and things like that that will solve the problem. Are you guys starting to pick that up? I know I've specifically heard Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, make that exact argument. In the next decade or two, AI will solve climate change.
Right, and what Doug Burgum says, it's a greater crisis for us to lose the AI battle, and we should just be investing everything we can in AI. This is going to solve a lot of our problems. And again, that has an appeal. It sounds hopeful. We as Americans are kind of raised on trusting technology, and also it allows us to just kind of continue on the status quo. But the truth is, we don't know what AI will do on climate change, whether it can solve some aspects of this very, very complex problem. But we do know that AI is using more and more energy. So if we expand AI without addressing energy use, we're going to be making the problem that much more worse. The truth is, and again, scientists have studied what are the solutions? What can we do about climate change? And the overwhelming consensus is there isn't one solution. There's a whole array of different solutions. Maybe we'll have to do something in industries like cement and steel that are different than what we do in other industries. Certainly transportation is one issue. Oceans are another issue. So again, it's tempting to hope rather than act. And the truth is that we're going to need many, many solutions. And The other thing is a lot of those solutions are more at hand now than they've ever been because of the drop in price of renewable energy alternatives. The fact that we're not taking advantage of solutions that are at hand now really doesn't make a lot of sense from a planning standpoint or anything else.
Yeah. Speaking of renewables, and disinformation and misinformation, I find wind, the whole Trump assault on wind, to be very rife with both. Um, uh, wind being detrimental to whales and birds, and having all sorts of perceived ills, and there are similar theories making the rounds about solar. Are you guys picking those up? Do you think wind is kind of the classic example of an industry being taken down by just massive quantities of disinformation?
Well, not only does President Trump himself has a long, long history of animus toward wind. He didn't like that it was off the coast of Scotland where his golf course was. He just doesn't like the look of it. There's just a lot that he doesn't like about it. He always talks about its impact on wildlife. The science is very clear that the most damaging things to birds are big buildings, oil, and the oil industry much more damaging than the wind industry.
Power lines.
Yes, yes, power line. It's the wind industry, especially the offshore wind industry in the US, is being taken down by President Trump himself. I mean, it's not being taken down because the science has shown it to be damaging. We did have a team of scientists looking very carefully at the environmental impacts of each of these proposals and trying to recommend things to mitigate those possible impacts. I think it has to be said that any form of energy, from cutting down trees, which, was humanity's first way of getting energy, it has damaging aspects, but we're so much more aware of them now, and to go forward without using that awareness and science and work on mitigating the problem, that seems to be to just close our eyes to reality.
Yeah. Bob, you live in Austria, um, and
Mhm.
spend a lot of time reporting on the EU and writing about the EU for us. Is this sort of skepticism about climate science a uniquely American phenomenon? Is this happening in Europe to some extent, or is it mainly something happening particularly now in the US?
It's not as much of a problem here as in the US as I perceive it right now, but it is a problem. I can give you a really local example about wind and wildlife. But I wanted to go back to the offshore wind for a bit because I think it's used as a disinformation, not so much anti-wind, maybe in the case of Trump personally, but more pro-fossil fuel because it's kind of an easy one because people look at these, pretty large offshore turbines and it kind of resonates if people say that harms wildlife, fish or whales or whatever. But the thing is, shifting back to Europe, there's thousands of wind turbines off the coast of Northern Europe and tons of studies about how they affect wildlife, how they improve habitat in some places, how some disrupted, and how they're learning to cite them. Um, but there is rising disinformation about wind power too. There was an elk that wandered into the part of Austria that I live in, the first elk to be spotted here in hundreds of years. And one of the conservative anti-renewable energy parties immediately picked it up as we don't want this wind farm that's being proposed for this area that had already been proposed. It's going to disturb this new elk that just wandered in. with, absolutely zero sort of scientific evidence or real connection between the two things, just the emotional aspect of elk, wildlife, industrial wind installation to trigger people emotionally, really, to generate an emotional response, because that's what some of this disinformation is aimed at, enraging people or, making them upset, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, last question. So the Energy Department report that it's um, not so alarming about climate change, saying it's not as serious as we think, not something we really have to worry about in the short term. Um, the motivation for that was to set the stage for a debate over whether or not to repeal the endangerment finding, which is the legal principle that is the basis of the federal government's ability to regulate greenhouse gases at all. Um, um, we've talked about this new rhetorical approach by the Energy Department and by the Trump administration. Clever, sophisticated. Is it going to work? Are they going to, in fact, have they, in fact, set the table with this report to repeal the endangerment finding? Bob, what do you think? Or Marianne?
Go ahead, Bob.
Well, I don't think there's anything scientific in the report that would undermine the endangerment finding. If anything, the scientific evidence is even stronger now. And I think the National Academy of Sciences just confirmed that yesterday or today.
In its response to the report.
Right. Its
Yes.
response to the report and to the EPA's
Yeah.
proposal.
But I don't think it's I don't think it's a scientific question. It's more of a political question. I think Marianne's probably pretty well qualified to answer that.
Yeah, well, I think that they are going to succeed because, as Bob says, it's a political decision. The Trump administration is very clear that this is the decision it wants to make, and you've hinted at why. The endangerment finding is the basis for regulation of greenhouse gases in the United States under the law that we have now. And you get rid of that, and you get rid of any need to even think about the problem, which legally the EPA has a legal obligation to address the problem if there's an endangerment finding out there. In the first Trump administration, they dealt with that by proposing weak regulations. This shows how they're going further now. They want no regulations. They don't want to think about it. It's not something we need to worry about. That's the new message. And unfortunately, it's disinformation of
Yeah.
the
So
highest
this
sort.
was, yeah. So this was something they were going to do all along.
President Trump said it on the campaign trail that
Yeah.
he probably didn't get into the weeds and talk about the endangerment finding, but he said he was going to get rid of regulations on greenhouse gases in
Yeah.
every way.
Yeah. So part of me wonders why they even bothered going through this exercise of commissioning these 5 scientists and even commissioning this report.
I think that they knew that they have to go through a process because it's they want to they're going to face lawsuits. They want to have something to show for as the basis of their decision making, and uh, so they kind of handpicked a group of scientists, and Bob knows them better than I do, but they've been around for a long time. They have a very particular point of view against climate action. And the interesting thing is their point of view has not changed over the last like 20, 25 years at all. No, no, and that's kind of the tell or the giveaway that it's not scientific,
Right.
because science is always changing and evolving and reacting to new evidence. And these folks believed then and believe now, even though the cost of renewable energy has come down considerably, that it's not worth it. It's not worth giving up fossil fuels.
Right. All five of them reject the mainstream consensus that fossil fuels are dangerously heating the planet.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, look, thanks so much for joining me today. Happy Climate Week. And appreciate you being here. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in, watching this discussion today, for always reading our work, supporting what we do at Inside Climate News. We could not do this without you. Thank you.